Hey listeners, we're nearing the end of our 15th anniversary fundraising campaign, and we need your help to meet our goal. This campaign offers you a chance to win a unique food and music experience in one of the most exciting cities in America. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and you'll be entered to win dinner for two and 2 tickets to a concert in one of 8 amazing cities: New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Ardmore, Pennsylvania, and Asheville. All donations support our work educating food system storytellers. And when you donate, you can choose one of those cities and you'll be entered to win dinner and 2 tickets to a show. So help us reach our goal and enter to win dinner and a show in the city of your choice. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Roberta's, home of Heritage Radio Network for 10 years. Learn more about Roberta's at robertaspizza.com.
This week on Meat and Three, we explore the relationship between food and style.
I knew from the start that I never wanted to hot glue bread onto my body. I wanted to be able to enjoy it after, and I did.
Food, which is so ephemeral, right? It's something that you eat and it disappears. With an image, it remains. It stays alive forever.
Food and fashion align in that they're both lenses through which to look at culture, right? And they're both also tangible things we can use to express ourselves and our identities.
Tune in to Meat and Three, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Amanda Smeltz. We'll talk to Amanda about the wine and hospitality business and leaving it. I'm your host, Sam Ben-Ruby. Stay with us for the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. Poet turned sommelier turned poet, Amanda Smeltz left Pennsylvania to study at Marquette in Milwaukee. She stayed in Milwaukee, one of the world's great food and wine capitals, to learn hospitality, then headed to New York. A longtime Brooklynite, Amanda worked at groundbreaking Roberta's in Bushwick, Daniel Boulud's Bar Boulud and Boulud Sud, and eventually Estella and Cafe Altro Paradiso with Iggy Matos. Amanda Smeltz is a published writer and poet. Welcome back to the Grape Nation, Amanda. We're talking to Amanda live via Zencastr. Where are you physically right now?
I'm in my very hot front bedroom in Bushwick, Brooklyn.
Oh, okay.
Glamorous June in hot Bushwick.
So you're back in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And it's nice and hot. I want to say a few things. Amanda was on the show 4.5 years ago. Amanda, you were on show number 16, February 1st, 2017. And right now we are recording show number 189. And I want to read something to you that I read to you then that I want to read again now. Okay? So bear with me through this. Tonight, I'm too stupid to write a poem. Who knows what poetry is? I know. My voice is too pronounced. My pronoun I is a needless gnome. I fall asleep in the spelling quiz and sink to the shipwrecks and fathoms below. On the Titanic, mosses grow. The moon has been pronounced and burning tigers pounce right off the Golden Gate. Your poetry must obfuscate or end up middlebrow. Madonna says, take a bow. So that last line, Madonna says, take a bow, and the title of this poem, crown for a natural disaster. I thought it was very cool then, and I think it's very appropriate now. So I thought I would just read that back to you because I like hearing your poetry, and hopefully you like hearing it too. All right, so let's get started. But before we get into things, I just want to check in a little. I noticed from Instagram that you were on the road out west in Oregon.
Yep, for a couple weeks. I was out in Portland and the Columbia Gorge.
Now that was just take time, get away?
Self-edification.
Okay.
Most of my travel these days is at least somewhat educational.
Right. And I noticed you were at Haiyu Farm. Tell me some of the places you went to.
Yeah, I was there for a week and I was trying to meet, it was my third time at Haiyu. China and Nate, who run the place, have become friends of mine over the years. And because they're super plugged in on what's happening in that very young AVA. I was also meeting some other young people who are, either starting new projects or beginning to bottle their own wine in the area. So I was with Michael Garofalo from Cutter Cascadia, who's working in a really interesting sort of warm pocket of the Eastern Gorge. And I met some other young people. This woman, Bethany, from The Color Collector. She's got a brand new project where she's putting in some vines out there. Nice. So yeah, just tooling around, talking with some new folks, old folks, just getting the lay of the land on an appellation in our country that I think is really, really exciting. And I've been interested in for probably the last 4 or 5 years for sure.
Yeah, we had Nate on the show a couple times. He was just recently on, and it's always interesting to hear from him. He's probably arguably one of the coolest guests to listen to. And you beat the heat wave, I guess, but you're sitting in it now. Yeah. Aren't you heading somewhere in July up to Massachusetts?
I am.
Tell me a little about that.
I was accepted for a writer's residency or an artist's residency with an organization in Massachusetts called the Mastheads.
Right.
And it's so named because the residency takes place on a farm in very western Mass called Arrowhead, which was owned by Herman Melville and still belongs to the family. Yeah, so Melville had this small-ish farm that he would retire to in the summers to write, and he had friends come through and write there as well. And it's still, it's still an intact farm, but I guess somehow the organization that was taking care of that farm got in touch with the Massachusetts state government and their arts endowment and said, hey, we want to do something with this farm. Why don't we create like a public arts kind of works organization around the farm? And that launched, I guess, 6 or 7 years ago. And so now every summer they invite anywhere from 4 to 6 artists to come be on the farm property for a couple weeks. And they had an architect build mobile studios that they move throughout the woodland and the pasture land that's actually on the farm where you get to go work, sort of without electricity and without Wi-Fi for several hours out of the day, like 7 or 8 hours if you want. And that's a pretty rare opportunity, certainly to be connected to that kind of literary history, but also, just to get time and space to sit and think for that long. It's a pretty righteous thing. So I'll be up there for a couple weeks.
So whatever creative juices you have, that'll really get everything flowing. We're going to have to check in with you after that to see how the trip was and what comes about. Now, we will get to the fact that you are heading up to Massachusetts to write and, seclude yourself a little versus taking a wine trip to the Loire or Jura, which is really, why I wanted to talk to you. So to delve into it, I don't think any industry sector got hit harder than the restaurant and hospitality industry during the pandemic. What I want you to do, because it had so many effects on you, including what we're talking about now, is talk to me about life during the pandemic, during now, and what effect it had on you. And I guess it's fair to say, and what was interesting to me is how it's changed or it's changing the course of your life.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question because it's been a very long 15 months for, myself, but also for everybody in the world, right? So,
right.
So it's I think the complicated thing about talking about like, okay, you worked in restaurants, you worked through the pandemic, like what's the deal? The trouble with the conversation is, there's the global lens on what has happened and is still happening with the pandemic, which is that, millions of people have suffered and many hundreds of thousands of people have died. And that is something that I have tried to keep in front of my face throughout the course of this whole year, because whatever routine suffering or whatever inconveniences happen on the level of one's job or one's day-to-day work, one's routines being disrupted, they sort of pale in comparison to the reality, which is that, zoonotic disease brought on by the way that we interact with the planet is terrifying, right? And is
Right.
a disaster. And it's something that we need to take, like we're way overdue to take a hard look at this, because these kinds of illnesses have been emerging based on our relationship with the planet, with the rest of the planet that we belong to, for the last 40 or 50 years, right? This COVID-19 is not the first one.
No.
Like, I think a lot about agriculture these days. I sort of think about it nonstop. And, not only do I think about agriculture, I think about agriculture in the context of how we're treating ourselves, how we're treating our bodies, how we're treating the planet, like why we consume what we consume, but also what the impact is of our decision-making on everything and everybody around us, right? So in some ways, working in restaurants is like a teeny, teeny, tiny little version of thinking about those things, like where does the food come from that we buy? How much of it are we throwing away? How much glass am I burning through when I sell a ton of wine in a single night? Like you do start to kind of think about those things. And then you also think about like, what about labor? Like what's happening with myself and my body, what's happening to my coworkers and their bodies, their families' bodies, and that was the stuff that I ended up thinking about, especially on the front of like human bodies a lot during the pandemic, because it was such a, working in restaurants is so physical, from the get-go. But then when you add a physical element of, from March of last year until March of this year, everyone was really somewhat frightened by being at work, and that adds like an extra layer of, okay, this work was already hard emotionally and psychologically. It's hard physically. You're on your feet from anywhere for 8 to 10 hours a day. You're interacting with strangers all night long, and you sort of always have to be presenting a kind of hospitable demeanor. So there's all of the regular demands, but then there was an extra demand that's like, listen, I work with a lot of vulnerable people, and I myself got COVID immediately in that first wave back in March of 2020 in New York.
Me too.
Yeah. And I know like 27 other people who did.
And nobody knew what the hell to do then. I mean, it was just so new and literally novel to, everyone.
Yeah. And it was frightening. I think there were a solid 4 or 6 weeks where I didn't leave my apartment because my partner had it, and then I got it back to back. And we were just like, okay, well, we don't want to kill anybody, so we have to stay inside. And that's a really trippy experience.
It's the opposite of what your lifestyle was.
For sure. I don't think I was saying to friends in the spring, like, I don't think I've ever not gotten on the subway for more than like a week or two at a time. I wasn't on the subway for like 3 months. And
Crazy.
It's just a radically different experience of what it means to live and work in New York. And it casts a long shadow over many activities that might otherwise have seemed totally acceptable the way they were.
You hit a lot of areas, that I want to talk about. I mean, ironically, you hit everything that's, points of discussion for me. But I just want to say a couple things. First of all, it sounds like the pandemic gave you this global overall, perspective that it's not just, me, the industry. I mean, there's a whole, thing to it that I'm hearing from you. I also think you're right. We are a reactive society, not proactive.
Yeah.
We should have been doing things that we didn't. And, we're stuck there now, and you hit it right on the nose that when something like this happens, we're unprepared and we've done nothing for preparation. The other thing is, and I just want you to talk about this briefly, just because of who you are and what you were doing, you admitted getting COVID, and you were one of the people that it had an effect that was negative to what was important to you at that time, which was your smell and taste. I mean, obviously you freaked out a little.
Oh, it was unbelievably frightening. It's weird because on one hand, you're like, okay, I've been lucky. I've had, pretty solid healthcare much of my life. Even though I went through 10 years of being uninsured as a restaurant worker,
right.
But I've still had pretty decent healthcare through most of my childhood and adolescence. I'm in pretty good shape. Like I don't have any underlying sort of, conditions, right, that would make COVID especially dangerous for me. So on one hand, you're like, look, be grateful for the mercies that you have and let that be that. But on the other hand, when I started reading how this sense of smell and taste comes about, it's not like when you have a cold, right? It's not like you get stuffed up and you just can't smell anything because of a physical blockage. It's nerve damage. Yeah. And understanding that the virus, because of its entry through the mouth, the nose, or the ears, or the eyes, that its immediate kind of ground for damage first is in the nervous system, right behind your eyes and your nose. That's incredibly alarming. Like those nerves connect almost immediately to your brain.
Yeah.
And they're really close to your brain, And when I started reading about it, because I'm a sicko and anytime anything is happening, my first instinct is to go learn. If I have any kind of stress in my life, I'm let's learn about what's going on.
Quadrupled it. Yeah.
Yeah. If only because I wanted to understand what was happening to me. And there were a few days where I had this sort of moment of being like, what if this never comes back? What if I genuinely can never taste my food again? And can never smell, coffee, someone cooking, and wine. And I really was I felt a small inkling of what the grief must be to have something and then to not have it again. It's a really sort of stark thing to be walking around your little space, It's summer in Bushwick. When I open my front door to my apartment building,
you get the odors.
I'm bombarded with smell, right? I'm bombarded with smell, good and bad. And but that's part of living, right? That your human animal body is sort of communicating all of these things to you by the encounter with aroma. And it's communicating positive things and negative things and things to be wary of. You're having a very animal experience of the world. And to not have that sort of visceral connection to the aromatic world is, I realize boy, we really don't pay enough attention to how lucky this thing is,
We're not even getting into sight or hearing. I mean, all the senses. Now, in your sort of research studying, did it come to you at any point that it seems like it would come back? Did it put you at any ease or not necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, okay, well, don't panic. It seems like many people have had a sort of temporary version of this, but, but I have spoken to a number of people who are like, I am not the same. And whose senses of smell, are now patchy, or they're sort of half of what they used to be. And I do think that we're probably going to, out of the many, many millions and millions of people who've gotten this, illness, I think we are going to see at least some swath who do have permanent nerve damage. And, that it's just kind of heartbreaking, just like we're seeing people who have long haulers, symptoms and neurological symptoms,
Clear something up for me. Your smell and taste is near normal or not necessarily? Okay.
They're 90% there.
Okay. And hopefully we'll get a little bit. All right. I said to you that you touched on a lot of areas I want to talk about, but I think now's a good time to kind of set up, in the intro, you worked at some, pretty prominent and cool places. Estella and Altro Paradiso certainly are at the top of that chart. But tell me today, we're looking behind at all of that?
Yeah,
Tell me the decision you made and what you're doing, and then I want to go a little backwards and figure out a few things.
So I left my restaurant job about 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
And I think, in a few years, I probably would have made that decision anyway. It was my plan and my intention to sort of stay with Ignacio at Estella and at Ultra Paradiso for probably, 4 or 5 years
Right.
to get a really good run in and then kind of decide what's next. But I will say, without trying to, be self-indulgent, the last year of working on and off, because I worked for 6 months and then was furloughed again and then worked again for the last 4 months. It easily the hardest year I've ever had in my work life, and easily the most stressful, and quite frankly, like the least satisfying in terms of, am I working for the right reasons? Am I working for for a benefit to myself, or am I working to strictly benefit other people? And I'm having to take a hard look at that right now, because it's very easy in restaurants to kind of give your body and your brain completely to it, to work 60, 70 hours a week. And, regardless of how you're paid, like there's almost no amount of money that can make it worth it anyway. But then frequently people who are working like that are also underpaid. So there does come a moment when you're like, okay, my love of the thing aside, because I do genuinely love the work, and I've been working in restaurants since I was 14. So I have 22 years behind me in this line of work. It's not like I'm a dabbler, you know what I mean? My love of the thing aside, you do get to a point where you're like, okay, simply from a physical health, emotional health, mental health standpoint, like I don't know that I can sustain the intensity of this kind of work. I was already saying, okay, by the time I get 25 years in, I might call it, and start to transition into something else. But the pandemic absolutely sped that along.
Okay, so the pandemic did accelerate it.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right?
I mean, I don't know. I feel I have very mixed feelings
okay.
about
We had
it.
Yeah, I mean that's. I retract my I withdraw my question. It's a silly question.
Yeah.
It's not okay or okay. It happened, and this is the effect it had on you.
Yeah, I think
we'll leave it at that.
It's more like it's a moment of reflection for me now to try to gather my thoughts. Like it's an immensely intense 15 months. And then before that, it was still kind of pedal to the metal the entire way through it. Also, like I haven't taken much time to think or rest in the last, 12, 13 years of my career, and,
well, you will in the Berkshires in July,
yeah, for sure.
You'll have plenty of time to reflect.
That's kind of the intention.
Yeah. I mean, that's good timing for everything. And a lot of great people in the industry spoke up during the pandemic. They published articles and they made literally concrete suggestions, for change. I had a bunch of these people on the show, like Miguel de Leon and Julie Coney and a bunch of other people. I always wonder, and I think you would have perspective on this. We knew the industry's effed up, and as you talk, it sort of comes out, what's going on there. But why did it take the pandemic to shine like such a bright light on existing racism, diversity issues, inequality, and, sexual harassment, which has been going on before, during, and I'm sure now. Why during the pandemic? Why not sooner? I mean, what's your take on that? Because it really came to the top. Do you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I have a bizarre take on this, maybe.
I'd love to hear it.
I think it is easy without a crisis to continue in ruts of habit. Right? If there are deep grooves,
agree.
If there are deep grooves formed either in one's individual mind or in the cultural mind that are worn deeply and heavily by wagon wheels that you keep running through the same ruts, it's extremely difficult to bump that wagon up off that track, because we are creatures of habit, and it's actually how our brain works, right? Like we form habits when we are young, and they form wrinkles in our brain, and they become the ruts that we work through. And if we've chosen, insidious ruts to be running our wheels through, that's a long-term problem that can take a long time to undo. That's like what we're messing with right now. But I think that it's crisis that rends a superficial fabric that's been laid over top of all of that, rends it wide open, and everything kind of comes tumbling out. There are plenty of people who've been talking openly and consistently about these things throughout
before.
Yeah, for decades
Yeah.
before,
Yeah.
right? It's simply that it is without a critical mass of people talking. I think it is too difficult to want to get those wheels out of the ruts, and plus there's the, the sad truth that look, people at the top benefit from these things going on, and investors who have a lot of money and really glamorous restaurants and stuff, they benefit from people at the bottom only being paid minimum wage and less. They benefit from people not having healthcare, largely because they're allowed to kind of throw the money around and have all the fun and all of the glamour and all of the, exciting parts of being able to dine in fascinating places and whatever, but they don't have to deal with, the disadvantaged. They don't even see them. Right.
So you talk about the beauty of wine. I mean, we're all wine lovers, and through the years we realize it's all about the grape and the farmers and agriculture in the future. And we can do 5 shows on the beauty of wine. But you're not alluding, you're laying out how, I think in your words, it's wasted on the wealthy. Everything you just said, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I mean
that's
it's not just wine. It's sort of.
Yeah. I mean, wine's a good microcosm of society, of,
Totally.
how the wealthy, but it is pretty obvious, in wine and restaurants, how money sort of sways and it leaves behind, all those issues.
Yeah.
Do you, it's funny you said before, on top of everything else, with all the harassment, diversity, racism and all that, there's still the individual, the life-work balance, and the physical and mental welfare of the hospitality worker, which I think was as low recently as it has been, right?
Yeah, sure.
So do you have any hope? I mean, have the voices that tried to get the wagon wheel out of the track and the pause people had to take during the pandemic, do you have hope that things will change at any pace, or it's going to be more of the same? How do you're walking away from it in a good way. I'm not alluding you're walking away from it, but
sure.
You don't have to deal with it. What's your hope? What do you feel?
My hope lies in policy.
Okay. But explain.
If one hopes to try to change the thing, right? Just call it the restaurant industry, for example, by only talking and only kind of increasing people's awareness of the issues, and that is not followed by immense pressure on local lawmakers, state, federal, to attempt to fix some of the labor issues, the real estate issues. For example, if real estate were not set up the way that it is in New York,
Right.
you would have 10 times as many tiny independent businesses that would not have to underpay their workers just to make them work. Right? Like if you were able to rent a tiny storefront in the Lower East Side for $1,000 a month, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. You could pay everybody $20 to $25 an hour as a minimum wage, and it would be a completely different world, right? So one way to do it would just be to enforce a minimum wage of $20 to $25 an hour and start to work on policies that put some sort of real estate cap on, the companies that develop and own properties, right?
Right.
Like these would be concrete policy actions that New York City, for example, just as an example, could take to stop this city from spiraling out into the, unbelievable, capital suck that it is, right? And making it impossible for normal people just to have a little lunch counter or whatever. It shouldn't be. Restaurants shouldn't have to be this
sort of like the old days where there was stuff like that on every corner.
Exactly, right? And the disappearance of that kind of thing and the replacement of that thing by huge restaurant groups that have 5 properties, 10 properties, 16 properties across the country, and they keep opening new properties and whatever. like that model is because you have to do a dance with massive real estate investment. And that means that the only restaurants that will be left, like it'll start to look like the 70s and the 80s in New York again, where if you wanted to go to like a really impressive restaurant, you have to go into like extremely haute cuisine,
Right.
or you're only going to your neighborhood mom and pop shops. And honestly, at this point, I would rather only eat at the latter. Like I don't want to ever have to go back into temples to fine dining,
I agree with you.
I think there's hope, but if it's only if we make policy change.
I think in golf they call that a tough putt. I mean, I think you're spot on the suggestions. I got to be honest, unless you know more than I do, because you're even closer to the industry, I'm not sure much of that is, rolling yet. I hope we get to that. So I think it's going to take some time.
I agree.
So because of all of that, I mean, the way restaurants, wine, sommeliers reemerge as things settle down, a lot of more of the same, some good changes. I mean, what do you think we're going to see through the end of the year going into next year?
I have a very smart friend who works in London who said, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months ago at the beginning of this year, he said, the thing that frustrates me is that restaurant people, mostly, owners, but also like the commentators on the restaurant industry,
Right.
They don't even know that the worst is yet to come. And by that, what
Really?
he meant, the fallout is going to take time, right? Like, at my most recent job, for example, my owner is planning, potentially 2 new openings by the end of this year. But I can tell you from firsthand experience, we're severely understaffed. The management who has been working through this whole thing is exhausted. There's, everybody's talked about the staffing shortage across the city
Right.
and the country because this work is incredibly difficult, again, underpaid. And also, if you're not vaccinated, it's still really scary to be in a building with 40 other people every day. Like it's,
Agree.
so there's
Yeah.
all of these sort of deficits that we're running at right now. And then in order to quote recover, you've got people like slamming on the gas for growth and recovery, but no one has even had a second to like take their breath in. Right. So
Right.
I think what is going to happen over the next calendar year, is that more and more people are going to quit. And those people who quit will probably be replaced with young guns or young bucks who are excited and who are willing to be paid less and who are not so tired yet, who are looking for opportunity. But that means that also you bottom out an entire kind of, short generation of people who've been working in this
Right.
line of work for 10 years or 15 years or even 20. You bottom that out and all of that knowledge and all of that experience and all of that input sort of goes away. Right. And you
Yeah.
replace it with like inexperienced people kind of over and over and over again. And that's the treadmill. Instead of making it so that like, I would love to encounter at some point a Som working in a regular restaurant with a cellar that's got 500 bottles or like 500 SKUs or whatever, maybe 1,500. And that sommelier is 65 years old. Like
Right.
I'd be thrilled. I would. I'd be like, God, you're going to
Yeah.
know so much more than me. Tell me everything. And you see that in Europe. You don't see it here,
No.
right? Like you see people who have
No.
cavs that they've been working in for 40 years and they can tell you everything. And it's amazing. Like if I had that ability, like if I could build a cellar for 25 years so that I can be, 55 and telling people what's up, like I would love to. So yeah,
Well,
I think that it's going to bottom out pretty badly.
Yeah, which is, I don't think it's a take. I think it's, the truth and going to happen. And I think that, the way we run our business, you're not going to see that 50, 60-year-old Som. I think you're right. People are going to, get out and eventually younger people are going to come in and, that's a little sad. Amanda, we have to take a quick break. We're talking to Amanda Smeltz. Like I said, poet turned sommelier turned poet. When we come back, I want to talk to her about a few other issues, and I'm not letting her get out of here without talking about some wines. You're listening to The Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by Roberta's, home of Heritage Radio Network for 10 years. Roberta's was founded in Bushwick in 2008 and has become one of the most iconic restaurants in the country. HRN made its home inside of Roberta's in 2009, and together they have become part of the DIY fabric of the neighborhood. Roberta's, the pizza restaurant, is open for lunch and dinner 7 days a week and serves much more than just the famous wood-fired pizzas. Their team dreams up new salads, pastas, and sandwiches on the regular. Roberta's Tiki Bar is alive and well in the back garden, serving up frozen drinks in the summer and hot toddies in the winter. Stop by the bakery and takeout spot next door for fresh breads, sticky buns, and pizzas to go. And of course, there's the 2 Michelin-starred Blanca tucked away in the garden for truly daring diners. But Roberta's also extends beyond Bushwick, with multiple locations in New York City and now in Los Angeles. You can also find their frozen pies in grocery stores around the country. The spirit of Roberta's, like Heritage Radio Network, is everywhere. Here's to many more years of pizza-powered radio. Learn more about Roberta's at robertaspizza.com.
Okay, we're back. We're back with my guest, Amanda Smeltz, very prominent wine person in New York and poet. So I want to talk to you a little about wine. And I want to tap in because I think, you're one of the true wine people that has a specific vision. And, I want to talk about that a little. When you were at Estella and Altro Paradiso, you were really able to, put your imprint on everything. And you presented wines from underappreciated regions and styles, which was very cool. Tell me about some of the wines, regions, and winemakers that continue to excite you. And I ask you that because I like to drop some info on my listeners. So,
For sure.
When you were at the restaurant, now, and when we get to the wine list, we'll talk about some specific stuff too. So tell me about stuff that still excites you and, what's, out there that's kind of new that's exciting you.
Oh man, the list is so long.
Give me the highlights.
So do you want producers or regions or both?
Both. Feel free to take it wherever you want.
Okay.
Believe me, if we come out of here with a handful of, wines, regions collectively, that's a great thing for my listeners.
Okay, so some regions and producers that I think are not looked at as much as they should be, or just sort of unknown, but are where they have amazing history or there are new things being done. I'm absolutely in love with the Steiermark in southern Austria, which is right on the border of Slovenia and has connections to the sort of Adriatic corridor. So it's, even though they speak German there's old Slavic roots in the region, as well as, sort of touching down all the way to the Adriatic. So I love the white wines that are produced in the region by natural producers. I think Sepp Muster is an icon there, but it's a really rural area, so no one really kind of knows it, although those wines are finally gaining traction, at least here in our market. Right. There's a few tiny producers, Ewald Wehrlich, Chepa rather, from the winery Wehrlich, makes really stunning whites as well out of Sauvignon Blanc and Morillon, which is the local name for Chardonnay. So
Say that again and spell it for me.
Morillon is Morillon.
Wow. I don't know if I ever heard of that.
Yeah, Chardonnay only
shows
goes
you how
by
much
that
I
name
suck
there.
at this. Yeah.
But I also I've been watching Sicily really closely over the last couple of years for sure. I think that there's a huge sort of birth of a new wave of winemakers and young producers who are kind of taking a risk for the first time and opening their own small wineries and making a lot of really beautiful natural wine kind of all over the island. And it's really only in like a second generation that's happening in Sicily because the economics are so rough that, it can be really hard for people to produce their own wine and actually have that be a livable thing, Yeah. So there, there's to me,
white and red in Sicily, right?
white and red. Yep. There's,
Etna Biancos and all that are just
totally. I've been paying really close attention to the whites coming out of Alcamo in the northwestern corridor of the island, which is an area that, has a tradition of white winemaking, but there are more people kind of breathing new life into the white wines from there. I especially love Alessandro Viola. In that region, I think he's going to be iconic, even though I shouldn't tell you that because his wines are going to become more expensive.
yeah.
But I think he's really amazing.
You ruined it for everybody, Amanda.
Yeah, and then
what's funny though? Sicily has been a favorite of Psalms for a few years. Not forever. And there's the wines there. What's cool is that you could sit here today and specify a certain region, like Alcamo in the Northwest Corridor, which is kind of not the next thing, but they've been making great wines there, and you've discovered them recently. I mean, it's just great that even a newer region has even newer regions, which is nice.
Absolutely, and it's sort of exciting to see that it's not just Etna, right? Like, and
that's my
that
point.
We continue to discover different pockets that have been around, but are now getting new voices in those regions. And I've also I continue.
Give me one more.
Dig into unique pockets of Germany where there's also a rebirth of new natural winemaking happening in that country, around the regions of places like the Pfalz and Franken. Outside of the famous sort of Mosel and Rheingau, there are people experimenting with new grape varieties. Not new, but grape varieties that are lesser known on the global kind of scale, and are making wines that are a little less straight-laced and a little more avant-garde, and I'm extremely excited about that place too. Jonas Dostert is a producer.
Wait, say that again.
Jonas Dostert is a producer I've been really excited about there.
Okay, that's a good one. I think when people think of Germany, the Pfalz, Moselle, they don't think of Pinot Noir and a lot of the reds. Those are exciting, right?
Absolutely. There's totally beautiful red wine coming out of there now too.
Yeah, we should look out for that. I'm sure these have been favorites of yours, for a while, and they've been presented at the restaurant. Are there any wines, that you got on early that you were serving, that are now getting their due recognition? Which we just said is good and bad. I mean, it's good because these guys deserve it. It's bad because either the prices go up or you can't get it. But I mean, do you see stuff that you really, took time to understand and present to your customers, are now getting their due recognition? Yeah,
every one of those producers I just listed for you.
Oh, good. All right. So then you take a responsibility, for turning a lot of people onto these and talking about it, and then they become, evangelists, which is nice.
Yeah, I've tried to make that some of my MO. I think it's important for wine people. One of my big frustrations, just from an industry standpoint, is when everybody buys the same wines kind of over and over and over again.
Right.
And, you go to restaurants around the country, and depending on what camp of wine people they belong to, you see the same producers. It's like Balthazar Cornas over and over and over and over again.
That's a good example and a good point.
Yeah,
and there's nothing wrong with the example.
No, I love his wines, but the point
is legit.
Everyone buys the same stuff.
Yeah. Yes. So that's a good thing. That you moved away from all of that. The other thing I wanted to ask you was, the term natural wine, we wrestle with it, and you and I will agree that that's not the best term, but we know that it's, low intervention, farming is important, organics, biodynamic. I'm trying to figure out when the natural thing really hit you, when you understood it, you started drinking them, you started evangelizing and all that. There had to be a point. How far back was that?
The transition for me?
Yeah, I mean, when did you really, maybe you were drinking them and didn't realize, and then you delved into the story and then the makers and all of that.
Yep.
I mean, I'm guessing with you, it's longer than, where most people would tag natural wines. Oh, I've been drinking it 3-4 years, When was that?
2008, 2009. Because before then, I got training in a much more formal style of restaurant where the cellar was full of, in Milwaukee, where the cellar was full of California Chardonnay,
Right.
a ton of domestic wine, like, a ton of Merlot, a ton of Zinfandel, a ton of Cabernet Sauvignon, like very little European wine because, 15 years ago.
Didn't I say in the intro that Milwaukee is one of the world's great food and wine capitals?
Okay,
there's your diversity right there.
It's tongue in cheek.
Yeah,
but it's
well,
true.
you're explaining that.
Yeah. So I got a ton of training on sort of what everybody, at least in the States, was consuming at that time. And depending on where you are in our country, like it's still like that, right? Like if you're working in San Francisco in high end restaurants, not like the cheeky hip stuff, like you're still serving a ton of those wines you need to. Likewise, if you are in Europe and you're in a really high end, sort of restaurant setting, you're probably still selling a ton of classical Bordeaux and old school kind of Burgundy, right? So, but what happened in 2008 and 2009, which was my last year in Milwaukee and then my first year in New York, I encountered a handful of producers who farmed radically differently and whose winemaking was a little bit different. And they're totally burned into my memory because their wines were so shocking for how different they were. And they were immediately magnetic for me. And I marked them. I was like, these wines are different and I love them. And I went in
Amanda,
pursuit of them,
Was that the Roberta days? Or before?
No, it was, I worked for 3 years. I opened the Breslin and the John Dory and the Ace Hotel.
Which were open to interesting wines, not, the normal list. So that was the entree to the exposure.
And also, my wine director, general manager in the fine dining place in Milwaukee had a handful of them on the list as well. So they were hiding out in wine lists, right? And when I encountered them, they were immediately visible to me as radically different, like not just a little bit different, but radically different. And I was really compelled. I was like, okay, I have to know kind of why these things taste so different and why they're so beautiful. And that sort of led me down the path. But I think I was pretty solidly decided by about 2012, like after drinking kind of conventional wine and natural wine back to back and, really sort of seeing a lot of stuff. I was like, okay, for me, this is just the stuff that moves me the most. And I've been that way ever since.
Just curious, at that very beginning, was it mostly French wines or it was all over the place?
No, you're right. It was mostly French.
It was. Okay.
Yeah, it was mostly French.
And then you realize, they're doing it in Italy and in Eastern Europe and all that, which is very cool.
Yep.
I want to get to our wine list because I want to further pull out of you some interesting info. But I really can't end the show. We'll end the show with the wine list, but I can't end, the interview part with asking you the real question, which is, and if you know them at all, is what are your plans for the future? We know you're going to go to this, writer artistic retreat. What happens after that? And what are you looking at?
I am probably going to try to write a book. I'll probably try to write two. One of them is my own writing, right? My poetry, which is my sort of other life and my other career. But I intend to write a series of essays about wine and restaurants, if only because I've written one or two here or there, and they seem to receive positive responses.
Yes, I've read them.
And I do think that there is a little bit of a lack of sort of transparent writing about what it's like to work, in this line of work. And also the things that I've learned about wine over the years. I do think, at least from my coworkers, they've often encouraged me that they like to hear me talk about this stuff. So if only on their behalf, I might sort of try to put it all down into a series of essays and maybe find a publisher. Hopefully someone will want to hear it, but I intend to work on that for the rest of this year.
So wait, I have to ask you a dad question.
Go ahead.
So I love that. I'd love to read the book on wine and your perspective. And, for 4 years, I've been a poetry fanboy of yours. And I'm amazed that the poem I read then and now is called Crown for a Natural Disaster. I mean, when I went back to that, it's like, Jesus. And at the end, talking about taking a bow. But here's my dad question. So I support all of that. How are you going to pay for your rent and everything?
My own father asked me these questions, Sam. I would prefer
does.
you not.
So you need me like a hole in the head.
I will obviously have to take a job of some fashion,
Okay.
which I will probably do toward the end of this year, but it remains to be seen. My two thoughts are I will either take work in the distribution side of things,
Right.
but I am a restless soul and I don't know that sales will agree with me forever. It is likely that at some point I'm going to want to learn how to do viticulture myself.
Right.
It's the one thing that is missing in my understanding is, how to actually tend vines on my own. And not that I ever would want to enter into it as my like sole income, but I wouldn't mind, having somebody help me plant, 1 hectare or 1.5 hectare somewhere where I can like really practice it and kind of learn it myself and just have a little barn that's got 14 barrels in it and and try to figure out fermentation.
The good news is a lot of people.
Yeah, I do.
You know who can offer that to you. And last week we had Camille Riviere on, and she's a good soul too. And she has to do sales, for her business, but that's not the only thing. There's the viticulture and the winemakers and the story and everything. So I think if you want to pursue that, there's a good runway ahead of you. My last question, I think you answered, and it could be both. No parent likes to pick their favorite kid, right?
Yeah.
But if you had to pick between wine and poetry or writing, where would you go?
No, I can't choose.
But you know what? It's funny how you answered the question. You're going to try to write a book. You're going to continue on poetry. You would like to develop some, property by learning viticulture. And if you have to go on, the business side a little, you will. So it's a little of everything. I love all my kids. Good answer. All right. Here's the wine list. You answered it 4.5 years ago, and I think I'm going to compare the answers. I asked the same 5 questions. We've done this over 200 times. I post them on social media. Don't dwell on the answers. Just, answer what's on your mind. So the first question is, and if you answered it with the stuff that's exciting, you add to it. What are you drinking now? What's interesting you? What are you tasting? What's in your fridge? Do the seasons bring a change in what you're drinking? What's on the table now?
Let's see. What's in my fridge right now? I have an absolutely beautiful single vineyard bottling of Malvasia de Sitges from the Penedès in Catalonia from a producer I love. His name is Tony Carbo, and he bottles under La Salada. One of my absolute favorite Catalan producers, and he makes super aromatic, really delicate, really refined white wines.
Nice.
That's in there. I've got a bottle of Piquette from Wild Ark Farm up in the Hudson Valley.
Which Todd was on the show, and I think the Grape Nation had the guy that really popularized Piquette before anybody. And he's doing it like in the Hudson Valley.
It's so exciting.
Delicious.
So exciting. So I also have a bottle of Floreal cider, which is the cider that Hayu makes in conjunction with a big organic orchard in the Columbia Gorge, and they are just some of the most interesting, smoky, layered, really beautiful ciders, I think, in our country right now.
Yeah.
I'm drinking a lot of cider these days, actually. I'm sort of falling back in love with the winemakers who are working with other fruit, and I think that's very much
co-fermentations and all that.
It's a future path for our country, and I'm extremely excited about the quality of wine that we're making in that fashion, both in New York and Oregon and lots of different places.
All right, those are good ones. You don't have to give me more. I don't want to overload because I want you to answer my other questions.
No problem.
This was always the goofiest question on the list, but tell me Amanda Smeltz's favorite wine and food pairing. Not what you think a good wine and food pairing is, but what you like. And it's not something you're going to eat every week, every month, but what's that pairing? What wine, what food?
I'll give you one of my all-time makes me cry kind of pairings.
That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah. Claire Nadan is one of my favorite producers in Burgundy, and she has these old vine plots of aligoté that she blends together in a cuvée called Le Clou 34. And to me, it's one of the best aligoté on the planet, certainly in the top 2 or 3 in Burgundy. And
Right.
as much as I don't want to be a Francophile because it's so obnoxious,
Go ahead.
I've had it with, actual snails and parsley butter heated up in my oven. And it's like one of those things where you're like, God damn it. I want to cast aside Burgundy forever because of all of the stuff that's attached to it. But these snails and parsley butter and this aligoté is just face melting together. They're really beautiful.
Just so you know,
That's like a
nobody's
Christmas
ever.
treat.
Yeah, nobody's ever, and I say this over, nobody ever gave that particular answer. So, but it sounds like you think it's like the champagne and oysters type answer. You know?
It absolutely is. It's like a very fancy answer to give.
That's a good one because a good shout out to Nadine and snails getting in there. All right, good one on that. Third question, and you were insular, for most of your career, but you do get out, and now, you're out. See if you can answer this. Your favorite wine restaurant and/or bar. And I would put Estella in there because I've eaten there a bunch of times because of everything we discussed. And here's what I'm looking for you to answer. Great vibe, great list. Environment, knowledgeable people, great list. That's why I would say Estella. Who do you think outside of you, does a good job with that?
Man, in New York or anywhere?
You could go anywhere, and don't feel like if you don't say someone, you excluded them. These are just some you're pulling out of the air.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I go to different restaurants for different things, right? Like,
yeah.
So I go to the Four Horsemen because I can always drink something I love there.
Always a great answer.
Yep. I still go to Roberta's because I still think that their pizza is some of the best in the city. Also,
agree.
There's still some of my wines hiding out in that cellar, so that's totally good for me.
There you go. We do the show from there, so I get to go in and out of there a lot.
Yeah.
Give me one more.
I mean, and for a classic kind of thing, although I haven't been able to go for a couple of years for obvious reasons because of the pandemic, for one of the most classic meals in the city, like I still have to say Gramercy Tavern,
Yeah.
Chris Raftery has maintained that wine list beautifully. And if you want something that feels like the 90s still in New York, like that bar, it's hard to beat that
in
bar,
a good way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to beat that
I
bar.
agree. And Michael Anthony's still there and his food is still amazing. It's a classic that's held up. Those are good ones. All right. Fourth question, favorite all-time wine. There's a chance when I initially asked you this, I was looking for you to tell me the rarest, most expensive wine you ever drank. The question has evolved and I can give a crap about that answer. What I care about is what is that wine, that favorite all-time wine that has been important to you, that, woke you or had an impact or, that important wine to you. Can you think of one or two?
Yeah, there are several, but I was really, really lucky. A few years ago, I was working at this event called Riesling Fire that
yes,
is, big Riesling head stuff and whatever.
That's what's his name, Steven.
Yeah, from Von
Yeah.
Boden. I was working at this event and I was working with this producer, Weiser Kunstler, who I think are probably the greatest young producer in the Mosel right now. And they had brought a style of wine that I almost never drink, that I never touch because usually it's so heavily sulfured and it's so sweet that I don't really care for them. But they had brought a bottle of 2005 Trockenbeeren Auslese from their cellar. And it was one of the last 4 bottles that they had. Wow. And I opened it. And at that point it was 15, or 14 or 15 years old. And I was just moved to like absolute silence because they don't make this style very frequently. And it was a freak of the vintage.
Do you remember the vintage?
2005.
Oh, you did say that. My
Yep.
bad.
And I was just so moved because they made so little and they'd brought this unbelievable rarity from their tiny cellar. And it was absolutely stunning, weightless. And the sugar had sort of like lightened and dissipated, ethereal, powerful, concentrated, but like super soft and like just remarkable. It's one of those wines where you're like, wow, this is yet another thing that wine can do. And that's one of the most special wines I've ever had for sure.
That sounds like a good one. And I've had similar wines, and that wine, when it comes out, just everyone is in awe of it.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a bunch of Psalms around, because you know how much they love, Riesling. All right. So like I said, we're going to post all your answers. Last question, and I think you should be as good as anybody to answer this, so no pressure. Recommend to me best wine around 15, 20, 22 bucks. Recommend a white, recommend a red. You could do a region, like Muscadet is a good value for white, but you can get specific with winemakers. Give me one of each. I always say my kids are in their 20s, they can't afford to bring crap wine as a gift or a party, but they can't afford $30-$40. So how do you wow people in that range?
I think young producers, like people just kind of starting out, are a great way to go on this for sure.
Okay.
Before they get famous, so that's helpful.
That's a good strategy.
Yep. I'll give you a producer near that Alcamo region that I was talking about.
Okay.
The whites and the reds from Porta del Vento in northwestern Sicily are super affordable. The Catarratto is delicious. They make a red from Perricone that's amazing. So if you want to check out some really beautiful, naturally made, inexpensive Sicilian stuff, they're a great producer to go with right now.
That's great. So that's red and white. Yeah. Anything else come to mind?
Yeah,
that would cover the answer.
It does. If you wanted to do French, I think that the inexpensive wines from Bruno Rochard in the Loire Valley are a steal for how much they cost.
Rochard.
Yeah, they probably clock in more toward the $20 mark. But
but that's the range.
And the Grelot are out of this world, and he's a little hard to find. But if you can find him, it's unbelievable quality for the price.
Well, we're going to look for them. All right. You did a great job on that. You gave me some great recos. And like I said, I'm going to post them. Amanda, I am sorry to have to let you go, but we burned through an hour pretty quickly. And I was excited about this show because of what's going on in your life and your take on everything. So I appreciate you coming on. Let me do a quick wrap up, and then I want to get some info from you. If you have a question, suggestion, wine happening, or event, hit me up at sam@thegrapenation.com. That's sam@thegrapenation.com. Subscribe to the Grape Nation podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. Follow us on Facebook at The Grape Nation. On Instagram, we're at SBenRuby. On Twitter, we're at BenRuby. I know it's a little confusing, but you can always use the hashtag The Grape Nation to get to us on both. We're trying to build a little community on Clubhouse, so follow us at BenRuby there. Like I said, I will post within the next week Amanda's wine list and any other wines she mentioned on our social media site. Amanda, I would say to you, where can we follow you? I still want to, and then I would say, tell me about the restaurants. Even though all the restaurants you worked at, you liked, we don't have to do that. But if people want to follow your life and travels, are you open to telling them where to go?
Yeah, for sure. Instagram's the best place. I try to, make little notes about where I am and who I'm visiting and that kind of thing. My handle is Smeltzmonger, so you're welcome to follow me there.
That's SmeltzMonger, right?
Yeah, that's right. If you don't like pictures of books and texts, though, you won't enjoy following me. So that's a warning.
I like that stuff, so I'm happy for that. All right. Thank you to our guest, Amanda Smeltz. Thank you to our engineer, Matt, and everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam BenRuby, and you've been listening to The Grape Nation. The Grape Nation is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like, tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. And thanks for listening.